Why play Sorcerers? Well, you have an AP opener with Sorcerer units, you want to play a buffed high cap comp that is more relevant this patch, or you have a spot for reroll or a Sorcerer emblem that you think you can play towards vertical Sorcerers. However, please know that this comp is often quote-unquote bait, or it's very weak before hitting. It's expensive and hard to stabilize because it doesn't have a very strong front line unless you hit 3 stars, and often the units that you are rerolling are very contested. It also requires a spat if you're not playing reroll, which can really hurt its ability to cap if you just try and play it without those particular win conditions. So, just as a general reminder, please make sure to like and subscribe if you do like my content. A lot of you are returning viewers, and I do guides like this daily for TFT. More guides are on the way. I know there's a lot of requests of different people for different things. Today we're talking about Sorcerers, because Sorcerers were recently buffed. If you don't know what Sorcerers are, basically they're the trait that just gives you a bunch of AP. All the units just get a bunch of AP. It's very simple. It's very easy. There's usually a trait like this in every set of TFT, but basically your team gains 10 ability power, and then Sorcerers gain more. And then you can put it as a 2 trait, a 4 trait, a 6 trait, or an 8 trait. And the 8 trait has an extra added ability where abilities reduce their target's damage by 25% for 3 seconds, which is quite interesting, especially since a lot of the Sorcerers have multi-hitting abilities, so you can actually reduce a lot of the damage output of your opponent. This got recently buffed. All the numbers are now a lot higher, especially with 6 and 8 Sorcerer, so it's becoming a little bit more relevant, and people are starting to realize that it does have a lot of potential, especially if you can get to the 8 Sorcerer cap. But when should you play Sorcerers? I don't think this comp is particularly strong. I think some people really enjoy it because it does cap very high, and if you hit the 3-star units, you do really well. So a lot of times just having AP items or a Shojin or Mana Gen, something that gives you the indication that you want to play towards AP, Sorcerers is a viable option. However, I wouldn't really play this without a Sorcerer emblem, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. It's mostly just to do with frontline and the amount of damage output that you can have, and the fact that the reroll units are often contested. Not contested that people are going to be playing Sorcerers with you, more so that they're just popular units that a lot of people are going to hold on to in their early game, their mid game, and sometimes in their late game, which can hurt the comp a lot. Now, let's think of some late game boards. Before we do so, I'm just going to go over the trait in general. We're not going to look at stats for the trait because the stats are very raw. Actually, we could just look at it just really quickly. The stats are very new because I'm doing this on the day of the patch. I want to try and make a video that's a little bit more relevant instead of talking about comps that people already know about, because Sorcerers is kind of going up in popularity very recently. But typically when you look at Sorcerers, we'll look at last patch data, but last patch data is very similar to current patch data. Basically, like 2 and 4 Sorcerers has this nice little even spread where it's not that good but not that weak, and then 6 Sorcerer a lot of times is bait. Just because it's a little bit harder to play around 6 Sorc, because a lot of times you're dropping frontline units and then you're making your board weaker when you can play other versions of capping the board. A lot of times these are people that are trying to play Swain, Nami reroll, and then they cap out around 6 Sorc, but a lot of times it's better to cap out around Form Swapper, so that's why it's a little bit worse. But then even last patch, 8 Sorcerer, that was really the juice where you usually hit pretty well. Or sorry, if you hit everything, you would do pretty well. It was often very strong. It just wasn't like a first thing giga broken comp. If we look at the current patch, however, things are pretty much all the same. Even though Sorcerer got buffed, that's what I'm saying. You shouldn't be too scared about, like, you know, things got buffed, things are broken. 6 Sorcerer, it's getting a lot overplayed, I think, because people are trying it out in the new patch and trying to figure stuff out. But it's similar to like the other patch, maybe even worse performing. But obviously this is 1 day of data. This is like updated as of like 7 p.m. It's not really deep stats, so I wouldn't worry too much about this. But then if you look, because of the buffs with 8 Sorcerer, it's doing significantly better. Now it's like a top 1 comp if you can get to that 8 Sorcerer mark. Now this is a hard thing to achieve, so obviously it's going to be skewed towards the top, but compared to last patch, it's already looking more promising if you have a Sorcerer emblem that it's a good idea to play towards Sorcerers. But without much ado, let's just go into the units themselves. Some of these units are very popular that you're going to see very often. That's the problem with Sorcerers. A lot of times, other comps are using these units very often. You'll see Lux, which is one of the more popular 1-cost units to play around your early to mid game. Zyra just got recently buffed, so there's some things people are doing with Zyra now that they weren't doing before. Vladimir, which everybody buys because of Black Rose. Swain, which is just known to be like an early game demon, and most people use him as either a frontline or a backline unit. He's good at both spots. Nami, who's Emissary, which most people buy. LeBlanc, who's very popular, but then Zoe's the only one that like nobody really plays around that much unless you're playing around Rebel. Rebel has this like stick where, like, I don't know what it is, like everybody kind of like hates Rebel. and thinks that it's like really, really bad because of its reliance on Jinx. But it's like, it's not that bad. It's kind of mid. Like, it's definitely mid. It's not like a top 1 like giga broken comp, but like it's definitely slept upon. There's a lot of spots where you can play Rebel and just get an easy top 4, but people throw that away to like contest a stronger comp, and then they go 8th anyways. I find that in my lobbies a lot. So like I don't know if that's the same experience with you, but Zoe isn't that bad. She just takes a really long time to get damage out, and even in Sorcerers that's not really that remedied. But either way, that's like the only unit that you can probably hit for free because less people play around Zoe. But all the other units, maybe Zyra, but like everybody else is pretty hard to hit, and that's the main theme that happens with Sorcerers. Now this is the board that's probably making waves to everybody. This is the 8 Sorc board, or typically what you would consider to be the 8 Sorc board. The idea is that you just play all the Sorcerer units. You need an emblem. You have the emblem on the Elise, and then on level 8 you hit 8 Sorcerer. This comp is extremely strong, and a lot of times if you hit this comp you can play for a first. Now this comp, it looks very simple because it's a level 8 board. However, you have to understand that it requires both an emblem, which I put on the Elise, and it also requires the LeBlanc, which is a 5 cost. You can spend 100 gold on level 8 rolling for a LeBlanc, and you might never find the LeBlanc. There are many times where I level to 9 and I roll 60, 70 gold even, and I don't find a single copy of the 5 cost that I want to find. 5 costs are very rare. They're elusive. They're not like impossible to find. You can definitely have enough odds to guarantee finding a 5 cost, but this isn't something that you can reliably stabilize around very early. Additionally, if you look at this comp conceptually, what is the glaring weakness that you might see? Like, there's something, if you squint your eyes a little bit and you look at the board, it doesn't pass the eye test for me. Now what eye test am I talking about? What doesn't this comp pass? It's the fact that my front line looks like dog shit. It is so bad. That's the main problem with Sorcerers. Like, whenever you're playing vertical swords, there's too many backline units, right? This Zyra, this Lux, Nami, these are all backline units. If you look at the front line, the only Sorc frontline units that you can play are Swain and Vladimir, and both of these are often contested. So a lot of times when you're playing around Sorcs, what you end up trying to do is you don't play it as a level 8 board. You typically want to play it on level 7, and you want to reroll for Swain 3 and Nami 3 star. Whenever you're playing around Nami, you want to have like casting items, like a Shojin. They get a lot of AP from the Sorcerer traits. You don't need to put a Rabadons on her. You don't need to put like an Archangels is probably a waste of time. Like, stuff that gives you AP is useless because you have so much AP if you're playing around Sorcerers. And a lot of times because she hits like AoE, you'll put something like a Morello on her. So a lot of times I'll put like Morello, which gives a bit of attack speed, Shojin, which helps her to cast, and then something that gives damage amp or crit, like a Jewel Gauntlet or something otherwise. Nami has this effect where she hits multiple units, so she's a really good holder of Morello. But really, Morello can go on anybody, so if you're going for full damage on Nami, I like to just give her crit chance, because she has so much AP because of Sorcerer, that having the crit chance is just a great buff to make sure that the ability actually does like an insane amount of damage. But damage amp items are also good. You just want to avoid something like Archangels and something like Rabadons. Typically, Rabadons is okay because it gives some damage amp, but typically Archangels is like pretty like mid because of diminishing returns. But sometimes you can go like full crit as well. You can go like Guard Breaker with Jewel Gauntlet for more damage. Or you can even go something along the lines of, I'm looking for Giant Slayer. I can't find. You can go like Giant Slayer, Nashers, just have her have a lot of attack speed and still do some damage. So you have lots of options in terms of backline carry. Swain does this effect where he heals based on AP. So if you give him a bunch of AP, he's just going to heal more. For that reason, I really like to have HP items on him typically. Something like a Warmogs is pretty fun, because he just heals a bunch, so you just give him like, you juice him with a bunch of HP, and then it'll be a really strong frontline unit. And if you look at this, it starts to make a little bit more sense if you're able to reroll both Swain and Nami. But Swain and Nami are often like, you know, if I look at an average board, like, and I scroll through everybody's board in a lobby, most often I will see people with either a Swain or a Nami on their board, because Nami's emissary, so she's good in mid game, especially if you're playing AP, and Swain is just known to be a really good frontline and backline unit. So a lot of times Swain is just held by people for a majority of the game, which hurts your ability to reroll, because unless they're like getting rid of their Swains at the opportune time that you're rerolling, you're often rolling while feeling contested, and while they might sell their Swains eventually late game, it sometimes backfires on you if you're trying to play around those units. Now, with the rest of the board, it is very strong. You can also itemize towards Zoe 2-star as well. With Zoe, you build her, you don't have to build her with Guinsoo. Guinsoo is more when you build her with Rebels. So I don't think Gwinsu is that good on her because she doesn't have the starting AS from Rebels anymore because you don't have the Rebel trait active. Instead, I would just build her with like a Shojin Nashor's JG, or even like Shojin Nashor's Guardbreaker. I like a lot. Just Guardbreaker gives some attack speed, so it's not like the worst thing in the world. So she does cast quite fast. But her casts do a lot more damage because you guarantee a little bit more likelihood of getting that crit chance, so you can snipe the backline. LeBlanc, a lot of times you can put utility damage on her, but with 8 sorcerers, she actually does an insane amount of damage. So putting like strict damage items on LeBlanc is also interesting. And the other sorcerers, you're just playing mostly for synergy. In order to remedy the fact that you're so reliant on Swain 3 as a frontline, Swain 3-star with 8 Sorc is definitely going to be enough to frontline. However, until you hit 8 Sorc, like if you don't have a LeBlanc, sometimes it's a little bit awkward to play. Black Rose helps a lot because you get the Scion in. You're already playing 2 Black Rose units because of the inter-team Sorc synergy of Vladimir and LeBlanc, both being Black Rose and both being sorcerers. So it's very easy to play Elise here. Elise gives you Form Swapper for the Swain, which helps you out quite a bit. Now, if you don't have an emblem, an additional way that you can play this is with additional Form Swappers. So this is a similar idea of Swain with Nami reroll. Additionally, because you have like the opportunity, if you hit a Swain 3, you might be able to put Gangplank in the backline for more damage, or vice versa. If you hit a Gangplank 3, you could put Swain in the backline for damage. This is a very high roll comp. This is the comp that I see a lot of people kind of talk about a lot when they're talking about Swain Nami reroll. So they're always like, oh yeah, like Swain Nami reroll or Swain Gangplank reroll is so strong. There's lots of different variations. I'm going to show you the other variations as well. The problem with rerolling this way is that you need to find not only a Jace, but you also have to find a LeBlanc. Like, yes, you can drop the LeBlanc. There are versions of this where you play Emissary, for example. So this is Emissary for Sorcerer. So you just play like, you know, any Sorcerer unit, Swain backline with Nami backline. This is a very stable comp. However, if you're relying on Nami and Swain for backline damage, you need to reroll them to 3-star, or else they're going to fall off really hard in your late game. And if you're rerolling them on level 8, it's like, do you have enough gold to hit this very expensive Emissary board, which you need to guarantee Garen and Ambessa in order to have a front line? You're going to need a Garen 2-star and Ambessa 2-star, right? It starts to fall apart really fast because you don't have the front line. The best way to ensure that you have front line when you're playing Sorcs is to have the Swain 3. And the Swain 3 is going to be hard to hit. So that's why I say you should have a good spot for it when you play towards it. Something that helps is if you have a target dummy. I don't think I can put the target dummy here. I don't know how to do it. Let's just take a random unit that we know for sure doesn't belong. Oh, I got a target dummy. Never mind. Let's say you have a target dummy with a Sorc emblem, like you get it through an augment or something else. That helps a lot because you basically just have an extra frontline unit. Or if you have a golem, like it's trainer golems, like in Bessa Encounter, and you have a Sorc emblem on that, these are better spots to play around Sorcerer. If I see Sorcerer on an Bessa, I'm highly considering playing towards Sorcerers. If I see a target dummy that I get Sorcerer, I'm much more inclined to play towards the 8 Sorcerer line, just because I stabilize my front line a little bit, because when this Swain is 2-star and this Nami's 2-star for much of my mid game, things can fall apart very fast because your front line dies before you actually get to pop off with all your Giga AP Sorc damage. Of course, with 8 Sorc, that's less of a problem because you just have so much damage that usually the fights don't last that long, but still, it's just something to be aware of. For Form Swapper, this is really bait, and I feel like, you know, if you actually hit a board like this, I'm pretty sure this is a level 9 board as well, it's very difficult to hit everything. So a lot of times, if you're playing around like the higher cost units, typically you go towards one of the Emissary lines, either going to be a 4 Sorc 4 Emissary line where you're playing around Swain Nami. Swain backline does an insane amount of damage, so as good as he is as a frontline unit, a lot of times if you can get him into the backline and have a stable enough frontline where you don't have to put Swain in the frontline, these are the boards that when you see them, they pop off. These are the boards where it's like out of nowhere you're like, I thought these units weren't that relevant, and then all of a sudden you're just dead. Like, these are the boards that delete people, because Swain in the backline with the Nami, they both have like a little bit of like an AoE effect. Like the Nami has the ball that bounces to multiple people, and then the Swain has like the multiple ravens or birds. I don't know if they're ravens, but he shoots all the birds and stuff. These two together just absolutely melt. So playing something like this is very strong, but like I said, Emissary is already a hard board to play if you're not re-rolling. So this is a very high roll board. It's very high roll to have all the Emissary units, to roll on 8, and to also hit these units. A lot of times if you're in a spot like this, you would have been better off playing another AP line, or you would have been better off just playing towards emissaries from the start, because you have a good spot for emissary if you're able to hit all the emissary units as such, and then you could just cap out around 5 costs instead of trying to reroll to find your Swain Nami. Now obviously if you have AP items and plans change and things are interesting, that's what usually happens. Better yet, I think the bigger problem is that the better board to play a lot of times is just to play around Form Swapper. For Form Swapper and playing around Jace is a lot better than a lot of these boards that you're playing around. If you're playing around Form Swapper and you're playing around these high cost units, and you're trying to reroll like Form Swappers, this is like the typical Gangplank Swain reroll, which now we're getting a little bit far away from Sorcerer, but I just want to give you guys an idea that when you're playing around these units, this is an example of a board that's easier to play around. That's why I say I wouldn't really play around the Sorcerer lines, or I wouldn't really be going for like Swain 3-star, Nami 3-star, unless I have a Sorc emblem, because a lot of times, even if you have these units and these items, you're better off just like playing towards some of these higher cost boards that are a little bit easier to play. This one is hard because you need to find a Jace eventually to hit 4 Form Swapper, but it's just something that fits in a little bit more nicely, and it's also more flexible. Because like, you know, all of these units are interchangeable, you could basically just play Emissary Flex and find some other backline carry that you can play for the meanwhile. But like I said, I wouldn't really go for any of these boards unless you have a bunch of Swains and Namis. Like, let's say you start the game off and you have like a Swain 2-star and a Nami 2-star. It's like, yes, that's a really good spot to play any of these variations, which is really nice. But like I said, I wouldn't really angle myself towards it. I wouldn't start the game stage 2 and say to myself, today I'm going to be playing Sorcs today. I wouldn't do that unless I had an emblem. Even with the buffs, I still think that there's just not enough stability in your mid game and your late game because of how little frontline you have, right? If I remove these target dummies and I just show you this frontline, even with Black Rose, that's assuming you find an Elise and assuming you find a LeBlanc. Before you have the LeBlanc, what are you playing, right? If you're level 7, this is your level 7 board. It's like, no, this is shit. This is absolute garbage. So then if you're not rolling on level 7 is where you want to roll for Swain and Nami because that's like your best odds. Then you want to do like this pseudo level 8 board because then you want to level to 8 to try and fix your front line a little bit, either add a Bruiser or add a Watcher or add something to help this out, because you're not going to have Swain 3 instantly, you're not going to have Nami 3 instantly. So then if you're leveling anyways, then you're losing the odds of finding the Swain and finding the Nami. That's what I mean by it has to be really high roll. And then if you don't, by the time you find LeBlanc, a lot of times the game is over. Now, if you hit this board and you high roll into it, it is very strong. Trust me, you're going to win the game. I'm not saying you're not going to win the game. What I'm saying is you get a lot more stability when you have the emblem, because it gives you like, until you hit LeBlanc, you have more wiggle room to play extra frontline units, right? Because look at this now, right? Let's say I'm on level 7. Level 7, I don't have to play all these sorcerer units. I have a free spot now. With this free spot, I can play any frontline unit. I can find a way to stabilize. I can play a Gangplank until I find Elise, right? Because I don't need to worry about getting Black Rose in to stabilize my front line. And then I can find some other dude. I can just find some random Watcher just to soak up some damage so that my backline has enough time to do something, right? Like, these are boards that you can play intermittently until you hit your max cap board. That helps out a lot. And that's why you only get this type of flexibility when you have an emblem. Of course, people will have successes, and people will say like certain things are good, to each their own. I just want to make this video today because I see that Sorcerer is getting played a lot, just got buffed, and I thought, hey, let's do like a little recap, a little interesting and theory crafting and stuff like that. Now we're going to talk about some more fun boards that you can try out. These are things I saw like once or twice today. I'm not sure if they're actually strong, but this is something that was really good a really long time ago. So in PBE, this was a board, so this was in the beta for the set. I played it once or twice, and it was really strong. This is Lux Zyra reroll. So Zyra 3 just got a huge buff to her damage. So Zyra 3 is very strong right now. This is a board that's not played that much. I'm not sure how strong it is, but the idea is that you're just rerolling Sentinels with Lux and Zyra in the backline, and then you can level to play additional Sorcerers, or you can level to play additional other synergies. Like if you have a good Academy item, you can drop 2 Sorcs, and you can play like I've seen Rumble, what's his name? Not Rumble. I've seen Ezreal with Tristana. This is the board that I used to play a lot in the beta to try it out, because I thought this was going to be a very meta 1-cost reroll, and then it ended up that it wasn't because Violet was like, whatever, we'll talk about that. That's a whole nother story. But in this case, a lot of times you can put like damage items on both Lux and Zyra. Zyra just got a huge buff. So I think that, you know, building her A lot of times I would put utility items on her because she just hits a lot of units, so getting a Morello on her is really good. But now you can go for like full damage on her a lot of the time, and it's quite strong. Additionally, I've seen boards like this that people have been trying to experiment, just like make like these light up the synergies on the side and make these interesting creative boards. The idea here is that this is a spot where you just have like a worth the wait Zyra, or you have a random Zyra 3, and you have AP items. What you can do is you can play around Bruiser, get in experiment, because Zyra's experiment bonus is really strong. So if you have a Zyra with items with her increased damage to 3-star Zyra, she now does extra bonus true damage to units that she hits. And you can get that true damage on her that has an AoE effect, and Mundo that has an AoE effect. And additionally, you can just find synergies. You can play Black Rose to make your front line really stable, and then you can play Swain in the back line. This is a interesting, quote-unquote interesting comp. It's not like, you know, I wouldn't necessarily angle myself towards this at the start of a game, but it is a little bit, it is just a fun board that you can try out. Additionally, you can play more sorcerers with this setup, because, like, you know, your board kind of looks like this for the most part. I don't think it has that much damage. I think you're really relying on also hitting Swain 3, and this is like a little bit of a weird board, but it's something that I saw somebody like theory crafting like on a stream. I forget who it was, and I was trying. I don't think this is a good board though, but it's something you can try out if you have like a Zyra 3. This board might become good. I don't know. It just depends on like Sentinels and how much they're contested, because Sentinels are really contested by the setup for Renata reroll. But this is like another option if you have sorcerers. Like if you have an abundance of 1 cost, you reroll for Irelia 3, Lux 3, and Zyra 3. But typically if you're playing sorcerers, you're trying to go for Swain 3, Nami 3. If you can have them both in the back line that your front line is stable enough, that's really good, because they both do an insane amount of damage. But a lot of times you need to have Swain 3 in the front line in order to stabilize your board. So some early game boards. So when you're playing around the early game units, sorcerer boards, like basically any AP board is very interchangeable, right? A lot of times you'll see boards that look very similar to this, just around 1 cost in general, right? The idea is that you're usually playing around Sentinels with Lux and Zyra. Sentinels works out well because of the Academy synergy. Academy early game just helps you out a lot. If you find the Academy item is useful, then you just up a whole item on your opponent, which helps you out a lot early game. But you can play this with pretty much anything, of course, right? If you have like an early Sorc, you just have your Sorc backline synergies. You're making your AP items that are very generic, and then you're usually keeping yourself open to multiple AP lines. Additionally, what I would say is if in your early game you have a very early setup for Swain, for example, then you can play around Swain pretty convincingly. Swain is really strong as both a frontline or a backline unit. So depending on what kind of upgrades you have. So for example, here I'll put like a random Irelia 2-star, and then I'll put a random Vex 2-star. Sure. Right? If you feel like your front line is lacking, then you can easily just carry or you can put your Swain in the front line. And a lot of times this guy is absolutely broken on stage 2, and it's usually like a 5 streak. Like he's one of the best units to hold early game, because he's just so hard to deal with in those early fights. He's just heals so much. He doesn't die. He's very strong. However, if you also have a lot of frontline, so for example, if I didn't have this Vex, I need a backline unit, he also does an insane amount of backline damage. So he can carry you for much of your mid game as well. So Swain is a very strong unit, and if you end up finding like, you know, a lot of Swains, then you could just play around sorcerers because they got buffed. Even with 6 sorcerer, I think if you have a Swain 3 with 6 sorcerer, that's where you're really popping off. So if you just hit the unit for free, obviously just play around sorcerers, and then you can just like play the Nami as an auxiliary carry afterwards. But usually with your opener, I wouldn't really angle myself towards Sorcs in particular, unless I get either an emblem or I have a huge amount of Swains. That's just like the main point that I'm trying to make. So conditions for success with sorcerers. So you want to have a strong early game. Your mid game is going to be really spotty because the comp doesn't easily allow itself to fit in multiple sorcerer units while also playing a viable front line. A lot of times if you're playing around Sorcs, it's going to be better to drop to, like, you know, let's say this is your mid game board. A lot of times it's going to be better to drop down to like 4 or even 2 sorcerer units, just because you need to balance the amount of frontline that you have with the amount of backline that you have. The amount of damage that you can do is as dependent as your front line is on, like the damage that you do in a fight at TFT is dependent on how long your front line could sustain that damage to do. So the 6 sorcerer buff is not that, like, it is a lot of AP, but a lot of times because you don't have enough front line, by the time these units actually cast, they're not making use of that AP. So you need to stall out enough time for them to cast, or to cast multiple times, in order to actually pop off. And a lot of times it's not worthwhile because you're playing so many low cost units, and if you're re-rolling, you're going to be stuck on a low level for a while. It becomes very difficult to stabilize the board. So being strong early remedies that, because if you win out on stage 2 or you win out on stage 3, you have the HP to allow yourself to hit the units, which will then spike your board very strong, right? If you have a setup like this, I guarantee you'll probably be top 4. Swain 3, Nami 3, it is almost always an absurd amount of damage, and it just got buffed, so I expect it to be even more this patch. But you need the time to hit those units, and that's the thing that I always stress about when you're playing with this comp. It's not something that leans itself very nicely into a cheap front line that just sustains itself very nicely. Additionally, often a spatula, I wouldn't really want to play vertical sorks unless like I said, unless I hit Swain 3 for free, or you often need a spatula. I think a spatula is probably one of the most important things. If you see a spatula, I recommend that you try it out. I think 8 Sorc, whether or not you have Swain 3 or Nami 3, a lot of times, if you actually hit the LeBlanc, you will be in a game-winning spot. Also, with the Sorcerer Emblem, one thing I should note is that if you're rolling for Swain 3 and Nami 3, you're usually rolling on level 7 odds. Level 7 odds, you do have a chance to find 5 costs on level 7. Because you're rolling so much gold on level 7, I'm sure you see this all the time with Automata players. I'm sure you see it all the time with other reroll players, right? There's a version of this board that I didn't show you that's more of a Conqueror setup, right? Where you play this board, but you have a Conqueror emblem and you play like 4 or 6 Conqueror Swain reroll. That's like something else that I don't want to talk about here, because that's like a completely different board altogether. That's like a Form Swapper Conqueror board if I make a separate Form Swapper video. But what I'm trying to say is that whenever you're playing those type of boards where you're rerolling on level 7 odd, a lot of times you find the 5 cost anyways. So what ends up being really nice is that if you have the Sorcerer Emblem, you're rolling on level 7. As soon as you see one copy of LeBlanc, you just level to 8, and then you play 8 Sorc. It's a very nice transition that allows you to cap your board very high. I don't know which Sorc I'm missing, Zoe, right? Because a lot of times when you're rolling on 7 odds, you're going to find the 4 cost for sure, and then sometimes you just find the 5 cost over time, right? If you're stuck on level 7 for many, many turns and you're rolling every single turn, eventually you hit. And if you hit, then 8 Sorc is a huge power spike. It also has a damage nullification effect, which helps out your front line, right? The biggest problem with this comp is the fact that you don't have that stable of a front line. A lot of times you're going to be playing something like an Elise just to get the extra dude in, right? The extra Scion to help out with your front line. But until then, a lot of times it's very weak. So having the damage reduction effect with the 8 Sorcerer is very, very nice. So make sure to always keep that in mind. You want to have lots of Sorcerer units because I think that if you high roll, like if you hit the units without having to roll too much, then it's definitely a very high cap comp, because the higher your level can go, the more you can fit in stronger units to help tank as well as do damage. So I think it does cap very high. You want to have gold for reroll as well as augments for reroll if you're playing the reroll variations like I was talking about, where you're trying to find Swain 3, Nami 3. You also want to be generally uncontested on Nami and Swain. What I mean by this, you just want to make sure that not too many people are playing around comps that are going to be holding on to Swains. For example, if you're trying to play around Sorcs and there's another guy with a Conqueror spat, I would be very cautious. The chances are he's going to hold on to every Swain he sees, and it's going to be very hard for you to hit the Swain 3. Additionally, if somebody else is trying to play Sorcs, this is not a comp that I would say I would want to play contested. Also, an early LeBlanc is a huge success con, because if you hit that 8 Sorc early, it is definitely one of the win conditions. It's one of the strongest comps you can play. It's just very contingent on 2 things, the spat and the LeBlanc, which makes it very risky, especially if you're committing to it earlier in a game. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. I did try today to make something that wasn't as flushed out, because this is more of a relevant thing because of the new patch. Hopefully I covered it and I talked about enough of these things in such a way that it gives you some good tips when you're playing the new patch, not to get too baited playing around the Sorcs. Of course, there might be some other new comps that come up. I showed you like some of the spicy ones, like the Zyra one, and then there's some of these reroll ones that I think might end up being strong. I'm not saying they're definitely strong. We still have to wait and see, because obviously like the patch has to have time to muster and find its footing with the players. I myself haven't played all too much the current patch, so I don't know for sure. I haven't tried out everything, but I said to myself, let's make something that's relevant today, and then tomorrow we'll go back to general guides. There's a lot of them that people are requesting, so I still have to make one of these for like experiment, but then I also want to make griefing and playing contested and guides on like fast nining and stuff like that. So all of those are to come. Don't worry, I read the comments. I haven't forgotten about it. There's a little list that I have, and I'm trying to put them in order in a coherent way. But thank you for watching, and hopefully you have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.